Well, good morning. It's me, Pastor Mike, and unfortunately, the video didn't get recorded this last weekend. So, out of a commitment to make sure that my materials are appearing on the internet, because, well, what it is I promised people who would be serving on Sunday mornings, if they were going to miss a sermon, they'd be able to have access to that information. So, I've got the sermon right here, and so I'm going to quickly preach the main points of it. I'm not going to do everything I did this weekend, partly because, as you know, I walk around and to keep people's attention, I kind of ham it up a little bit. Kind of makes me wonder if that's why I didn't get recorded, because I was a little too hammy maybe this weekend. Had a lot of fun with that sermon. It was a great sermon to give, but it's about holiness. And so let me present to you this information, which I presented this weekend. And we start with this concept of holiness, and we tend to think of that as just kind of this realm of priests and nuns and popes and angels and great saints of the past, people with that little ST at the beginning of their name, and maybe even Protestant ministers. Sometimes we think of that as being the province of holiness. This is the place where angels tread, and when men do tread it, they tend to tread it with their shoes off. So, you remember those videos or those movies from back in the old days when you would see St. Peter coming in a movie set. He just kind of floats in with his eyes locked on the skies, comes and lays his hands on whoever it is he's going to heal, heals the person, turns around, walks back out again, looking up into the skies. And you just kind of wonder, did they ever trip? That sort of thing. Holiness is no cards, no booze, no friends except for the minister and the deacons, and just flat out no fun. And it's contemplating spending eternity on a cloud playing the harp, and that just doesn't sound like something that's all that appealing. Sometimes we could think of holiness as being like a spiritual shield. It's like a force field around you that deflects temptation, and so we dress the people that we think of as spiritual leaders as having this spiritual force field around them of holiness, and so they don't experience temptations the way that those of you who sit in the pews do. And in fact, actually, there's really no difference between the pew and the pulpit. And in fact, I would suggest to you that it's times when I've been serving and actively serving that I experience more temptation than ever. And so just being real, the reality is if you're going to enter into service for the Lord, that's when the devil's really going to start throwing up his blockers. So, holiness is no guarantee that you're not going to experience temptation. So certainly there's an aspect of holiness that involves saying no, but there's so much more to it than that. It's really what we say yes to. And in fact, I would argue that holiness is actually saying yes to God. It's the idea that I'm going to love God with my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And if I do that successfully, what's going to happen is it's going to change the choices I make. It's going to change the direction, the vector of my life. My conduct will be different. And so we talk about our heart, where we make our choices, and our head. That's where we're informed about life, and then our hands, and that's kind of the metaphor that we use for our conduct, the things that we do. And all these things are going to appear in this sermon. And in fact, actually throughout this whole sermon series, it's going to focus a lot on our conduct. First Peter is about be holy in all that you do, and the word that he uses there is your conduct, your interaction with life and with the people who are around you. But let's begin with a study on the word holy, first of all. Holy is this word is hagion inside the Greek, and it means to be set apart for the use of a deity. It means to be consecrated. It means to be dedicated. It means to be reserved for that person. Now, it is analogous to think of us as having things that we set apart for certain people. And for those of you who know, one of the people here in our church, his name is Tony. We have a special chair for him in the back. That's Tony's. And heaven help you if you sit inside that chair and take it away from Tony. You're supposed to let Tony have this chair. And there's good reasons for that. I'm not trying to say anything bad about anybody, but the reality is this is just a person who needs to have this particular seating location. We talk about pianos as being set apart inside the church for God. We don't bang out show tunes or terrible music on it, but we reserve it for the use of the deity. So just as we set apart things for a particular individual, maybe it's a CEO, you set apart a special chair for that CEO. Even if he's not inside that meeting, nobody sits in that chair because that's for the CEO. In the same way, holy is setting apart things for the divine one. It's just a special term we use for that kind of a setting apart. A related word is hagiasmos inside the Greek. You can hear the same root in there, hagion, hagiasmos. And hagiasmos means to holyize something. You know how in our language, if you want to take a noun and you want to verb that noun. So for instance, you take someone who's not an American and you want to Americanize them, right? So we're going to add that I-Z-E to the end of it. American, Americanize. In the same way, if you're going to make something holy, you're going to holyize it, or hagiasmos. And that's the Greek word that's actually used in verse 2 of our passage that we have here in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 2, to sanctify. The sanctifying work of the Spirit is to holyize something. Another time we see the word hagion used is to refer to the saints. And so when we're using hagion as a substantive to describe a people, we're describing the saints. The idea behind the words is these are the holy ones of God. These are the ones who've been set aside for the use of a deity. So when you become a Christian and you've trusted Jesus to be your Savior, you become one of his hagion, his holy ones. And so when you hear the word saints, think about that. That's part of your identity, is the fact that you have been set apart for a deity. You belong to him. You are his. That's an amazing truth, I think, right there, that can set you free from a lot of bad ideas and bad thoughts. What we're going to find about holy is that we're going to find that loving God with our heart, our mind, our head, and our hands, if we do those things well, we're going to have holiness be a byproduct of our life. And so these three spheres of transformation that we have, heart, head, hands, are going to be playing an important part in this sermon series, and especially today. So this whole thought process that we have in verses 1 through 12 all play into what we're talking about today in verses 13 through 16. And that's going to be the passage we focus on today, is 13 through 16. I know it seems kind of weird to start not at the beginning of the book, but actually a little ways in. But 13 to 16 really talks about the main idea for all of the book of 1 Peter. The whole book is really about be holy in all you do. It's about what we ought to think inside our heads. It's about the decision that we need to make inside of our hearts about holiness, and then the conduct that's produced by that. And most of the book refers to the conduct that comes from being holy. So let's look at Peter's command here in verse 15, which is part of that little passage, 13 to 16. And we're going to look at his command to be holy. And the word there is genetheta. And genetheta has the idea of to become. And the interesting thing about this particular verb is it's in what's called the aorist imperative. And in fact, actually, the grammarians, and I actually went back and I checked all this, the grammarians refer to this particular one as an ingressive aorist imperative. Now, imperative, you have the idea that that's a command. So you can have a command that's a permissive, and let us go to the restaurant. Or you can say it's a command that is, you're going to do this. So let's go, we're going to the restaurant, right? That's another form of the command. One you'd use with your friends, the other one maybe with the kids, right? This is also an imperative. And it's an aorist as an inceptive or ingressive aorist. And so the idea means is that we're going to start doing this thing. So you would use, if you were to translate back to the Greek, let's say you went to your doctor, all right? And so at your doctor's office, he said, okay, now it's time for you to quit smoking, or it's time for you to start that exercise program, all right? We would translate that as an aorist imperative. We would say, it's time to get started, folks. It's time to get busy. It's time for us to get started with an exercise program. It's time for us to get serious about stopping smoking. Whatever it is that you're told that you need to get serious about doing. Maybe if you walk into a group of kids, maybe back in your days when you're helping out with Boy Scouts or whatever, I don't know. You walked in and here the dentist fooling around and say, okay, let's get started here. We're going to get started doing the thing that we're doing, right? This is the ingressive aorist imperative. And so that's what Peter is doing here. He's saying it's time for us to get serious about holiness, folks. It's time for us to get busy about being holy. What does that tell us? Well, it says that it's quite possible that there was a little problem in the church, right? And he's sensing this. He's writing this letter, and he's saying to them, he said to them, verses 1 through 12, look at what God's already done for us. And so, therefore, it's time for us to live this holiness, this sainthood that God has called us to do and to be. All right. So this suggests to us, by the way, that we are a work in progress. And so many of us just think, hey, you get saved, you got cosmic fire insurance, and now you just need to do the right thing, or that the person up at the pulpit is just going to automatically do the right thing because he's holy, right, or he's supposed to be. But the reality is, this word suggests that we are indeed a work in progress. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But Peter is saying, hey guys, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I know, but nonetheless, it's time for us to get serious about it. It's time for us to get going on this and get going on that 2 steps. And yeah, we're going to fall back a step here and there, but we're going to get going on 2 steps forward. We are positionally holy, by the way. That's even suggesting this idea of the Hagion as being saints. God looks at us as his saints, right? And he wants us to regard ourselves as his saints, set apart for him and for the use of the deity. But the thing is, we are not practically holy. And that's why Paul has to tell us in Philippians chapter 3, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That means we need to be moving forward on that and actively participating in that process with our heart. We got to make a decision. That's what genetheta refers to. It's time for us to start. The imperative, it's an appeal. Let's get started, heart choice, and start rethinking about our lives and work out our salvation with fear and trembling, right? That's our head, right? And then produced out into the conduct, our hands, right? So we are a work in progress. And then what we have here in this little section right here, 13 through 16, 13 through 15, I hope you had a chance to read this, by the way, is that all these words that are right here describe how that is to take place. Okay? That's a very important idea. This is all one idea inside the Greek. The idea is that these are adverbial verbs, if you will. These verbs all describe this action of being holy. Okay? And what we're going to see here is that it'll have to do with changing our thinking, getting our heart involved in this whole thing, our hands, all those sorts of things. So let's take a look at the first one here. And your NIV Bible, if that's what you're using here, literal translation is going to look at it a little bit differently. The NIV accurately translates the idea, though. It says it's time for us to be ready to be holy. Okay, that's kind of the idea in a nutshell. But the literal, if you want to put it that way, the idiom that's behind that, maybe that's the best way to say it. The idiom that's behind what the NIV says there is gird up the loins of your mind. Now you're probably thinking, loin? Gird up the loins of my mind? I thought loins was something I got at the butcher shop for a pig, right? That's kind of the sort of thing that you might think. But loins refers to those our legs. We might refer to them as the upper part of the legs. That's where we get a lot of our strength, our force from. And back in those days, if you wanted to go to a battle or if you had to run very suddenly, you had a tunic or another long garment that you would wear on you that would go down oftentimes to your ankles. And suddenly, let's just say there's a bandit raid on your town. And you've got to go fight, you've got to draw swords, or you just got to flat out run. And what you got to do then is you got to draw up that garment and basically tie it off right at the mid-thigh or a little higher so that you have the ability to jump, move, dodge, swing a sword, and have that power stance so that you can fight the battle or you can run or dodge as needed. And that's called girding up the loins. It's about being prepared for a fight, right? It's the idea of being ready, and holiness is a fight. It's a battle. It really is. And so what we have to do then is prepare for that. And Peter's using this wonderful terminology to describe this idea that we got to get ready for this fight. We need to get our minds engaged around this idea that this is going to be a battle. Some commentators, though, see something else a little bit different inside this, and I think it's very intriguing. They see it's a callback to the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, you have this thing where the people are supposed to eat the Passover Seder. How prepared? Prepared to go on a journey. They're going to be going off the next morning to leave the land of Egypt. And so they were told to eat this Seder with their travel clothes on, basically, and prepared for flight. And so what would they have had to do? They would have had to gird up their loins. They would have had to been prepared for flight. And so you see in this the idea that we may be having to go on a journey. And so many of the Jews of Jesus' day and before that expected that when Messiah comes, that what we'll have to do is we're going to go on a new exodus. We're going to leave this world on a new exodus. And so Peter may be referring to that here in this passage. He may be referring to that concept, the idea that it's time for us to get going and leave this world system and all of its temptations behind. And so that might be part of what he's talking about here as well. We're going to go on adventure. We're going to go into battle, all these sorts of things. The second thing that he says here in this passage of Scripture is that holiness is a pattern or a schema or a plan for living. Okay? Now, if you look in the passage, it says, do not be conformed. And this translates a very complex word, suskemada. And the idea of schema, you hear the word schema in there, it's a plan or a pattern or a script, if you will, for life. And so, if you want to think about the fact that one time maybe you drove all the way to, your grandmother's house, your mom's house, and it's on the other side of town, and it was a half an hour drive, and suddenly you got there and you realized you were on autopilot the whole time. It's the idea that you were living a script, a description for how you are to drive. And that's basically kind of the idea that Peter's talking about. You're on autopilot. You have this set of assumptions and plans that you live according to that you don't necessarily think about on a daily basis, right? One of the things we say here at First Congregational Church is that a person can be saved, but when a person receives Jesus Christ and repents from their sin, they still think like a sinner. They still have all those habits of thoughts of mind that they have had and was drilled into them all the way from the beginning right to the time where they become a Christian. And so there's a new plan, a new schema that we have to learn to live by. And of course, that's informed by the Scriptures. It's informed by your pastor. It's informed by your Bible study. It's informed by reading good Christian thinkers and all those sorts of things, and getting into Jesus' head and rethinking according to the way that he thought. So there is this standard of behavior script that the world system imposes upon us that says, here's certain types of things. Peter says, I don't want you to be conformed to that anymore. I want you to think differently. Don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be conformed to Jesus Christ. All right? So when we're conformed to the pattern of this world, the pattern of this world says certain things to us. It says you deserve a break today. It says that you have certain rights to certain kinds of things. And the thing is those things, when they don't get realized, it creates frustration inside of us. And oftentimes we want to shortcut God's plan for us and basically live that frustration and shortcut that frustration, shortcut God's plan, and that shortcutting very often, in fact, 99% of the time, is going to produce sin, right? And so what Peter is saying to us here is watch those shortcuts. Don't shortcut God's will. And so then he says right here, is that instead, hold fast your Christian hope. He says right here that we are to live a life full of hopeful expectation for God's return. Now, let me explain what I mean about this idea about frustration, all right? Let's say you're frustrated over loneliness, all right? You're a lonely, lonely person. And so one thing that sometimes, in fact, a lot of times people do in our culture is they don't have that intimacy. And so instead of waiting and then finding intimacy in proper kinds of ways, healthy kinds of ways, Christian types of ways, they might shortcut what God's plan is and then go and have a sexual relationship with somebody outside the context of marriage because they're lonely, right? And so they commit sin in this. Let's say you're concerned about resources and you're fearful for the fact that you might be short on resources someday, and so you hoard, right? You shortcut God's plan that we are to be good to others. Instead, you hoard resources. Okay, so that might be a way that you live in greed, which is, of course, also sin. Or you're fearful for your reputation or for your job or for your life, and so you lie. That's another way we shortcut God's plan for us. And what Peter says as an answer to that is, rest your hope fully upon the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed from glory. Okay? So think about that just for a second. Instead of shortcutting God's plan, I am to live in hope that someday the intimacy I didn't find here in this side of glory, I can find it in heaven. Or if I was short on resources, instead someday I have an inheritance which is preserved for me in heaven someday. I don't have to fear about the ending of my life and the resources I have then. I will wait on God and not be greedy. Or I know I'm safe with God. I know that He loves me unconditionally, and so I won't lie to cover myself. I'll accept responsibility if I need to accept responsibility or what have you. but I won't lie. And I'm going to trust myself to God. So those are ways in which having hope in spite of maybe what this world is saying to you, what rationality itself says to you, that there is no hope, there is no future, Peter says to us, there is a hope. And when you're tempted to not be holy and to not love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength in a given moment, then what you're going to do is you're going to say, you know what? Remember, Jesus is coming someday. And when he comes to you, it's going to be grace to you. So think about that the next time you're tempted to lie, next time you're tempted to be greedy, etc., etc. So that is kind of the introduction to 1 Peter that we have here today, to think about holiness, to get this inside of our head, right? We make a decision, today is the day I am going to be holy. All right, and then he gives us some things. We're to prepare our minds. We're to get our minds wrapped around the side. It's going to be a battle. It's going to be a war. It's going to be a new Exodus. I have to hold out hope for that someday that Jesus Christ is going to come back and he's going to rescue me from this wicked world. And I need to rethink the pattern of life that I've been taught since birth. I need to get into the Word. I need to get into the church. I need to study, all those sorts of things. And then the result of that will be a conduct, an outcome, in which my life will reflect the holiness of God, because I'm saying right here, I love you, God. You know, the great illustration of that, of course, is marriage. And when you say to a person, you know, I'm going to make a vow that I'm going to be faithful to you till death do we part, you are saying I'm consecrated to you in a real sense. And throughout the rest of your life, what you are to do is say to that person over and over again, by your conduct, I will love you. In the same way, if we're going to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, our behavior needs to say, I am separated to you, God. I am consecrated to you. And so I will love you with my heart, soul, mind, and strength in all that I do.